One of the most tragic queens ever to rule over England, Scotland and Ireland was Queen Anne. She reigned for a period of roughly around 12 years, but she died herself at a rather young age of 49. Throughout her life, she had been afflicted with a number of health conditions and issues, and in her 30s she got more ill and grew more obese. In the final years of her reign, she was unable to walk, and around Christmas of 1713, she drifted in and out of consciousness, but somehow she recovered. Despite there being many rumours that the Queen was on death's door, Anne would succumb to her health on the 1st of August 1714, following a stroke, and a doctor would write, "I believe sleep was never more welcome to a weary traveller than death was to her." But throughout her life, she also suffered greatly from an inability to produce an heir, and she got pregnant a staggering 17 times, but left no surviving heir whatsoever, and she was the last monarch of the House of Stuart. But what is the story of her pregnancies, and why did they go so wrong? Just before we begin, a short disclaimer that throughout this video we will be talking about stillbirths, failed pregnancies and miscarriage. These are all things that greatly affected Queen Anne, but if you are upset by these topics, please feel free to turn the video off. Anne was married to Prince George of Denmark, and he was the consort of her from Anne's accession in 1702 to his death in 1708. The marriage of George and Anne had been arranged with an eye on developing an alliance between Britain and Denmark, and George was not the most ambitious man. He was happy spending time with Anne, and lived quite a domestic, quiet life. And he would write, "We talk here of going to tea, of going to Winchester, and everything else except sitting still all summer, which was the height of my ambition. God send me a quiet life somewhere, for I shall not be long able to bear this perpetual motion." During the Glorious Revolution, he would desert James II in favour of William of Orange's cause. William was his brother-in-law, and when William and Mary, Anne's sister, were proclaimed joint monarchs, Anne was made the heir presumptive, meaning George, her husband, would later become her consort. However, for Queen Anne, one of the hardest things she had to contend with was the fact she did not have a surviving child that lived into adulthood to become her heir following her own death. It's been believed that the reason behind Queen Anne's miscarriages and stillborn children was because she suffered from a syndrome and an immune disorder that turns the body against itself. Anne suffered from chronic illness including gout, which was so extreme that she had to be carried to her coronation. As well as this illness, she also drank excessively, and this may have been a bearing on the health of her children, and one of the reasons why they died so young. The first child she gave birth to was a stillborn daughter, who was born on the 12th of May 1684 in London, but just a day later this daughter was then buried inside of Westminster Abbey, and it's likely that this caused a great deal of upset for the couple. Just a year later, though, Anne would give birth to a daughter named Mary on the 2nd of June 1685, inside the Palace of Whitehall. There was great hope for this daughter, and she was christened by the Bishop of London on the day of her birth, and was styled as the Lady Mary. However, despite being only around 20 months old, on the 8th of February 1687, Mary died from smallpox, after a number of other close people to her fell ill from the disease, but the young girl could not fight it off, and she died inside of Windsor Castle, and 2 days later was buried in Westminster Abbey. But whilst Mary was still alive, she also had a sister named Anne Sophia, who was born at Windsor in the May of 1686, but she too died of smallpox at Windsor Castle 6 days before Mary did, which meant that Anne lost her 2 daughters from the disease, which must have been devastating. Also, in the January of 1687, a month before these tragic losses, she also suffered a miscarriage. Now, Anne was childless again, but she seemed to have no issue getting pregnant. A stillborn son was born on the 22nd of October 1687 at Whitehall, but then straight away this child was buried again at Westminster Abbey. It was said that Anne gave birth to a child who was around 7 months gestation, However, the baby had laid dead for a full month within her. Further miscarriages would come in April of the following year, but then on the 24th of July 1689, there was much reason for Anne and her husband to celebrate. They had so far not produced a child that had lived past the age of 2, but at Hampton Court Palace, Prince William, the Duke of Gloucester, was born. William would be the only child of the royal couple to survive infancy, and he was seen by others as a Protestant champion who would later rule England. The birth of the boy was witnessed by several people, and it was said that the most of the persons of quality about the court were present, and 3 days later the newborn baby was baptized. He was second in line to the throne after his mother, but he was described as a rather sickly child. At the age of 3 weeks old, he suffered with convulsions, and his mother moved him into Kensington, believing that the surrounding gravel pits would help his health. But it's possible that he was suffering from meningitis, and this caused problems with his brain. Throughout his life, he had recurring health issues with his health and was treated by royal doctors who gave him an early form of quinine, which made him sick. He had an enlarged head, possibly caused by meningitis, and his surgeons pierced this to draw off fluid a number of times throughout his life. He could also not walk properly and stumbled about, and he refused to climb stairs without having 2 people help him, but his father then would beat him on the backside to get him to walk by himself. His acquisition of language was also delayed, and he did not speak well until he was 3. But as he approached his 11th birthday, he became ill, and at his birthday party he got very tired. That evening he had a sore throat, headache and a high fever, and his symptoms progressed over the next few days. Doctors did not know what was causing his illness. Some said it was smallpox, others scarlet fever. They administered whatever they could, but his skin blistered, and Anne went to her son's bedside, but became incredibly upset and faint. Prince William died at 1 a.m. on the 30th of July 1700, with his parents next to him, and this then destabilised the succession, with his mother Anne being the only person left in it. But during Prince William's life, Anne would have a number of other problems with pregnancy and giving birth. Another child named Mary was born on the 14th of October 1690 and was 2 months premature, and she lived for around 2 hours. Premature babies were likely to not make it during this time, as medical care was nowhere near what it is today. But this child also was buried within Westminster Abbey. 18 months later, at Sion House, Anne gave birth to a son named George, who only lived for a few minutes, and who lived through his baptism, where he was stalked Lord George, before he then died. Another stillborn daughter would be born on the 23rd of March 1693, and in the January of 1694, another miscarriage occurred. Some historians debate this baby was a girl or a boy, and a contemporary writer only noted that Queen Anne miscarried and did not specify what gender this child was. Another miscarried daughter occurred on the 17th of February 1696. All during this time Prince William was alive, but one miscarriage on the 20th of September 1696 was particularly tough. It was said Anne miscarried a son, and a letter documented that Her Royal Highness miscarried of 2 children, the one of 7 months grown, the other 2 or 3 months, as her physician and midwife judged. One was born the day after the other. With this it raises an interesting point that Queen Anne may have suffered from a blighted twin, or had twins, but one of these did not grow in the womb. Further miscarriages occurred, one on the 25th of March 1697, and before the year was out, in early December, she would also have another. It was said that Anne miscarried twins who were too early to determine their sex, but other sources state that the pregnancy ended in a stillborn son, or 2 male children, at least as far as could be recognised. Around 9 months after this tragedy, more would come the way of Anne, as she gave birth to a stillborn son on the 15th of September 1698, and this was then buried at St George's Chapel in Windsor Castle. The royal doctor believed that this fetus had been dead for around 10 days before he was born, but a final pregnancy resulted in yet another stillborn son on the 24th of January 1700 at St James's Palace. This child was then, like its siblings, buried inside of Westminster Abbey, and sources from the time state that Anne gave birth at 7.5 months gestation, and that it had been dead for around a month before this occurred. Now, obviously at the time in history, there was not the obstetrics technology or information around what would have helped Anne to have a healthy child who could have become the heir to the throne. It could have also been an issue with the blood types, and one of the royal couples being rhesus negative and the other being positive. However, Queen Anne today is considered a monarch who was incredibly tragic. Throughout her life she suffered greatly with her health, but also suffered from 17 pregnancies that did not lead to a child making it into adulthood. The closest she got to this was Prince William, who was an incredibly sickly and poorly child following his diagnosis of meningitis that led to him almost dying earlier than he did. Queen Anne today is a forgotten queen, but her emotion and heartbreak with regards to having children must have put strain on the relationship of her and her husband. It's clear the pair wanted children, but eventually this would all just end in tragedy. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.